Some debts can never be repaid, only honored through a lifetime of quiet devotion. For years, the giant Viking warrior Brandr had been leaving silver coins for the old man who raised him after his father's death. Every month, he walked through the pine forest to Halvor's cabin with his payment. This was duty. This was respect. This was how a warrior honored those who shaped him. But when winter came early and brutal, Brandr brought meat instead of coin. What he found inside that cabin changed everything he thought he knew about strength and protection. The old man wasn't alone. 7 forgotten souls had found shelter there, the broken, the lost, the ones society had abandoned. Would this discovery transform a feared warrior's understanding of what it truly means to protect the innocent? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first snow of winter had arrived 3 weeks earlier than usual, blanketing the Norwegian coastline in a silence that made even the boldest warriors speak in whispers. In the great hall of Jarl Eric's stronghold, the massive stone hearth crackled with oak logs, casting dancing shadows across weathered faces gathered around rough-hewn tables. The scent of roasted mutton and fermented mead hung thick in the air, mingling with the sharp bite of wood smoke and the underlying musk of wool and leather. Brandr Ironhand sat apart from the others, his enormous frame making the sturdy oak bench beneath him creak with every slight movement. At nearly 7 feet in height and broad as a ship's mast, he commanded attention even in silence. His hands, scarred from countless battles, wrapped around a horn of mead that looked delicate as a bird's egg in his grasp. The firelight played across the intricate braids of his dark beard, each strand woven with small iron rings that chimed softly when he moved his head. The other warriors gave him respectful distance, not from fear, though fear was certainly warranted, but from the deep reverence reserved for those who had earned their reputation through deeds rather than boasts. Brandr's war axe, Skullsplitter, rested against the wall behind him, its steel head gleaming with the oil he applied each evening before sleep. The weapon had drunk deeply of enemy blood across 3 kingdoms, and its reputation preceded its wielder into every settlement they visited. The northern passes will be blocked within a fortnight, announced Ragnar Whitehair, one of Eric's most trusted advisors. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of a man who had spent decades reading the sky for signs of weather and war. No raiding parties will venture forth until spring's thaw. A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the hall. Winter meant different things to different men. For some, it was a time of rest, of mending gear and telling stories beside warm fires. For others, it meant the slow gnaw of restlessness, the ache of unused sword arms, and the weight of too much time for thinking. Brandr drained his horn and set it down with deliberate care. The sound carried in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the nearby tables. When he spoke, his voice carried the low rumble of distant thunder. "I ride north tomorrow." Eric himself looked up from his seat at the high table, his silver-streaked eyebrows rising in question. "North, in this weather? The hunting will be poor, and there's little to be gained from—" "Not for hunting," Brandr interrupted, though his tone remained respectful. "For duty." The word hung in the air like incense in a temple. Duty was sacred among their people, more binding than any chain forged by mortal hands. A man's word once given became part of his very soul. To break it was to become less than human, a creature unworthy of Valhalla's golden halls. Eric nodded slowly, understanding passing between the 2 men without need for further explanation. The Jarl had ruled these lands for 30 winters, and he recognized the weight that settled on certain men's shoulders, obligations that could not be shed like cloaks when the weather turned foul. Olaf the Skald, whose silver tongue had preserved the deeds of heroes in verse and song for 4 decades, leaned forward with the keen interest of one who sensed a story worth preserving. "What manner of duty calls a warrior into winter's teeth, Brandr Ironhand?" The great warrior's eyes fixed on the dancing flames, and for a moment the harsh lines of his face softened with something that might have been memory. "I knew a man once," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with surprising gentleness, "when I was barely old enough to lift a proper blade. My father fell in the battle at Stamford, and this man, Halvor was his name, took me in when others saw only another mouth to feed." A respectful silence settled over the gathering. Every man present understood the debt that was owed to those who raised orphaned children, especially in times when food was scarce and survival uncertain. "Halvor taught me to track deer through snow so deep it reached my chest," Brandr continued, his massive hands unconsciously miming the drawing of a bow. "He showed me which plants would heal wounds and which would bring fever dreams. He sat with me through the night terrors that came after watching my father die, never speaking of weakness or shame." The iron rings in his beard chimed softly as he shook his head, as if clearing away cobwebs of time. "He could have sent me to the thrall house or left me for the wolves. Instead, he made me strong enough to stand among you as an equal." Ragnar Whitehair stroked his own beard thoughtfully. "And where is this Halvor now?" "Deep in the pine forests, 2 days' hard ride north of here. He built himself a cabin after his war days ended, said he preferred the company of trees to the endless talk of men." A ghost of a smile touched Brandr's lips. "He was always a man of few words, but every one of them carried weight. You visit him often?" asked Eric, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Every month when the moon shows her full face. I bring him silver, enough to keep him fed and warm through whatever trials winter might bring." Brandr's expression grew serious again. "It's little enough payment for what he gave me, but it's what I can offer." The gathered warriors nodded in approval. This was honor, as they understood it. Not the flashy gestures that young men made to impress their companions, but the steady, unshakable commitment that marked a true warrior's character. To care for one's elders, especially those who had shaped you in youth, was among the highest virtues their culture recognized. Olaf the Skald's eyes gleamed with appreciation for the nobility of the tale. "A worthy duty indeed. May the gods smooth your path and speed your return." As the evening wore on and the mead flowed more freely, the conversation turned to other matters. Trade routes that would reopen with spring, weapons that needed repair, and the eternal debate over which of the southern kingdoms might provide the richest plunder come raiding season. But Brandr found his thoughts drifting away from the warm hall, beyond the stone walls, and out into the cold wilderness where an old man waited by his fire. He had been making this journey for 7 years now, ever since he had earned enough silver in his own right to spare some for another's comfort. Each time he found Halvor a little more bent, a little more careful in his movements, but still sharp-eyed and quick-witted. They would share a meal and perhaps a cup of mead, while Halvor told stories of the old days. Not the grand battles that the skalds loved to sing about, but the smaller, quieter moments that revealed the true character of men. The old hunter never asked for the silver, never even acknowledged its necessity, but Brandr knew that life in the deep woods grew harder with each passing winter. Game became scarcer, and an aging man's ability to pursue it diminished with the strength of his limbs. The monthly payments weren't charity, they were investment in the kind of honor that couldn't be bought or stolen, only earned through consistent action over time. As the fire burned lower and the voices around him grew more slurred with drink, Brandr rose from his bench with the fluid grace that always surprised those who knew him only by reputation. His size suggested clumsiness, but years of training had taught him to move with the careful precision of a hunting cat. "I'll take my leave," he announced to Eric, who raised his drinking horn in acknowledgement. "Travel safely, Iron Hand. May your path be clear and your welcome warm." Brandr gathered his cloak, thick wool lined with bear fur that had kept him alive through a dozen brutal campaigns, and secured Skullsplitter across his broad back. The weight of the weapon was as familiar as his own heartbeat, a comforting presence that had never yet failed him in moments of need. Outside the great hall, the night air hit him like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped since sunset, and his breath formed thick clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the stables, where his horse, Grimjaw, waited in patient endurance. The stallion was a massive beast, nearly as famous as his master, coal-black, with white markings around his hooves that looked like chains in the moonlight. Grimjaw had carried Brandr through 3 major battles and countless smaller skirmishes, never faltering, even when enemy spears whistled past his ears or when the ground beneath his hooves grew slick with blood. Brandr checked the animal's tack with practiced efficiency, ensuring that every strap and buckle was secure. The saddlebags already contained what he would need for the journey: dried meat, hard bread, a skin of mead, and the leather pouch of silver coins that represented this month's payment to Halvor. But tonight felt different somehow. As he ran his hand along Grimjaw's powerful neck, Brandr found himself thinking not of duty fulfilled, but of opportunity missed. 7 years of monthly visits, 7 years of brief conversations and formal exchanges. Had he truly honored his debt to the old man? Or had he simply eased his own conscience with regular payments? The thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. Halvor had given him more than survival. He had given him purpose, direction, the skills and confidence that had eventually made him one of the most feared warriors in 3 kingdoms. Could such a gift ever truly be repaid with silver alone? As if sensing his master's mood, Grimjaw turned his great head and fixed one dark eye on Brandr's face. The horse had an uncanny ability to read human emotions, perhaps developed through years of shared dangers and long campaigns. "What do you think, old friend?" Brandr murmured, scratching behind the stallion's ears in the way that always calmed them both. "Should a man do more than simply pay his debts?" Grimjaw snorted softly, his breath forming a cloud that merged with Brandr's in the cold air. It was answer enough. The warrior made his decision with the same certainty that guided his axe in battle. Tomorrow's journey would be different. Instead of merely delivering silver and departing, he would bring something more substantial, fresh meat from his own hunt, proof that his gratitude extended beyond mere obligation. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest weight. As he settled into his sleeping furs that night, Brandr found himself looking forward to the journey with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring more than duty fulfilled. It would bring the chance to offer true generosity, the kind that came from the heart rather than from habit. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would also bring a discovery that would challenge everything he thought he understood about strength, honor, and what it truly meant to protect those who could not protect themselves. The dawn broke gray and bitter, with wind that cut through even the thickest firs like a blade seeking bone. Brandr had risen before first light, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to early departures. Grimjaw stood ready in the stable-yard, his breath forming great clouds in the frigid air as Brandr secured the final straps of his pack. The hunt had gone well the previous evening. A magnificent red stag, its antlers spread wide as a man's outstretched arms, had fallen to Brandr's spear in a grove of ancient oaks. The beast would provide enough meat to see Halvor through several weeks of winter, far more valuable than any handful of silver coins. Brandr had butchered it himself by torchlight, wrapping the choicest cuts in oiled cloth and packing them carefully in leather sacks that hung now from Grimjaw's flanks. As he swung into the saddle, Brandr felt a deep satisfaction settle in his chest. This was how a debt should be honored, not with cold metal, but with the fruits of personal effort and skill. Halvor had taught him to hunt. It seemed fitting that the old man should benefit from those lessons in his time of need. The ride north took him through terrain that grew steadily wilder and more remote. The first day's travel followed established paths through settled lands, where scattered farmsteads dotted the landscape like islands in a sea of snow-covered fields. Smoke rose from distant chimneys, and occasionally Brandr would catch sight of figures moving between buildings, life continuing its quiet rhythm despite winter's harsh embrace. But as the second day wore on, civilization fell away behind him like a discarded cloak. The path narrowed to little more than a deer track, winding between towering pines, whose branches formed a canopy so thick that snow lay only in scattered patches on the forest floor. Here, in the deep woods, silence reigned supreme, broken only by the soft thud of Grimjaw's hooves on frozen earth and the occasional crack of a tree adjusting to the cold. This was Halvor's domain, a realm where only the most skilled woodsman could survive for long. The old hunter had chosen his isolation carefully, building his cabin in a clearing so remote that even seasoned trappers rarely stumbled upon it. It was a place for a man who valued solitude above the comfort of human company, who found peace in the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the soft rustle of creatures moving unseen through the underbrush. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Brandr caught his first glimpse of smoke rising thin and straight into the still air. His heart quickened with anticipation. Soon he would see the familiar sight of the small log cabin with its moss-covered roof and the wooden bench, where he always left his monthly offering. Soon he would share a warm meal with the man who had shaped his youth and watch Halvor's weathered face light up with pleasure at the unexpected gift of fresh venison. The clearing opened before him just as memory had painted it, a rough circle carved from the wilderness, with Halvor's cabin standing solid and welcoming at its center. But something was different. Where usually only a thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney, today it billowed thick and constant, as if feeding a much larger fire than one old man would need. Brandr frowned, his warrior's instincts suddenly alert. He dismounted quietly and approached the cabin on foot, leading Grimjaw by the reins. Through the single window, golden light spilled into the gathering dusk, not the dim glow of a single oil lamp, but the bright radiance of a fire built for warmth rather than mere illumination. As he drew closer, another anomaly caught his attention. The snow around the cabin was trampled and packed down in a way that spoke of multiple sets of feet moving back and forth. Not the careful, economical tracks of a single inhabitant, but the chaotic pattern left by several people going about their daily business. Concern tightened Brandr's chest. Had something happened to Halvor? Had bandits discovered his remote retreat? The old hunter was still formidable despite his years, but against multiple opponents, a sound from within the cabin stopped his racing thoughts cold. Voices, not one voice, but several, men and women speaking in low, respectful tones. Children's laughter bubbled up from within, light and innocent as spring water. Brandr's hand moved instinctively to the haft of his axe, then stopped. Whatever was happening inside, it didn't sound like violence or coercion. He moved closer to the window, keeping to the shadows where the building's bulk would conceal his massive frame. What he saw through that frost-rimmed glass struck him like a physical blow. The cabin's single room, which he remembered as sparsely furnished and efficiently organized, now seemed to pulse with life. 7 people sat or lay around the enlarged hearth, 3 men, 2 women, and 2 children, who couldn't have seen more than 10 winters between them. They were dressed in rags that had once been fine clothing, patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible beneath the careful mending. But it wasn't their poverty that stole Brandr's breath. It was the expressions on their faces, peaceful, grateful, protected. These weren't prisoners or thieves. They were guests, welcomed and cared for with the same quiet dignity that Halvor had always shown to those in need. At the center of it all sat the old hunter himself, looking frailer than Brandr remembered, but with eyes that sparkled with familiar warmth. He was distributing bowls of what looked like thin stew, making sure each person received an equal portion before taking anything for himself. His movements were careful and deliberate, those of a man accustomed to making meager resources stretch to meet great needs. One of the children, a girl with tangled brown hair and eyes too, old for her young face, was showing Halvor something clutched in her small hands. The old man examined it with serious attention, nodding and making encouraging sounds that carried through the cabin's thin walls. Whatever the object was, he treated it with the same respect he might show a jarl's treasure, Brandr felt the world shift beneath his feet like ice breaking on a spring river. The silver coins he had been so proud to provide each month, where had they gone? Not to line Halvor's own coffers or to purchase comfort for his declining years. They had been transformed into food for empty bellies, fuel for a fire that warmed multiple bodies, medicine for the sick and clothing for the nearly naked. His monthly payments hadn't been supporting one old man in comfortable retirement. They had been funding a sanctuary for society's forgotten ones, the lame, the lost, the abandoned. People who had fallen through the cracks of clan loyalty and family obligation, who had nowhere else to turn when winter's hunger came calling. The realization hit him with the force of a war hammer blow. For 7 years, he had thought himself generous, dutiful, honorable. In reality, he had been merely adequate, providing just enough to keep one old man alive, while that same old man used his sacrifice to save 7 lives instead of 1. Shame burned in Brandr's chest, hotter than forge fire. How many nights had he felt satisfied with his monthly generosity? How many times had he ridden home from these visits with the comfortable glow of duty fulfilled, never suspecting that his adequate payments were being stretched thin as spider silk to cover needs he had never imagined. But beneath the shame, something else stirred, something that felt almost like admiration. Halvor had taken Brandr's practical charity and transformed it into something magnificent. He had looked at silver coins and seen hungry mouths. He had looked at a warm cabin and seen shelter for the shelterless. He had looked at one man's debt of gratitude and seen an opportunity to serve 7 desperate souls. This was honor in its purest form, not the battlefield glory that earned a warrior fame and respect, but the quiet courage required to open one's door to strangers and promise them safety in a world that had offered them nothing but hardship. As Brandr stood in the snow watching this scene of unexpected generosity, he felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The careful compartments in which he had organized his life, duty here, honor there, charity in its proper place, suddenly seemed inadequate to contain what he was witnessing. The sound of approaching footsteps crunched in the snow behind him. Brandr spun around, his hand going automatically to his weapon, but froze when he saw Halvor himself emerging from the tree line. The old man carried an armload of firewood, moving slowly but steadily through the deepening snow. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Brandr saw no surprise in Halvor's weathered features, only the calm acceptance of a man who'd been expecting this moment for some time. "I wondered when you would finally see," Halvor said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Come inside, Brandr. There are people you should meet." The cabin's interior struck Brandr like stepping into another world entirely. Where once there had been the sparse, efficient arrangement of a solitary man's dwelling, now every surface served multiple purposes. Sleeping furs had been carefully arranged to maximize space while providing each person their own small territory. Cooking pots hung from newly installed hooks, and shelves that Brandr didn't remember seeing before held an assortment of personal belongings, small treasures that spoke of lives lived and lost. The warmth hit him immediately, not just from the enlarged hearth, but from something less tangible, the sense of a space filled with human presence and shared purpose. The conversation that had been murmuring quietly when he approached the window ceased entirely as 7 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Brandr had faced down charging berserkers without flinching, had stared into the eyes of enemy jarls across negotiation tables without a tremor of uncertainty. But standing in that doorway, confronted with the quiet dignity of people who had been reduced to accepting charity, yet maintained their self-respect, he felt more exposed than he had in any battle. "Friends," Halvor said, setting down his burden of firewood with careful precision. "This is Brandr Ironhand, the warrior I've spoken of. He's the one whose generosity has made this possible." The shame that had been building in Brandr's chest intensified. Generosity. The word felt like a mockery when he looked at what Halvor had accomplished. With what Brandr had considered adequate payments, One of the men, middle-aged, with the calloused hands of a craftsman and a face marked by old grief, rose slowly from his place by the fire. "We owe you a debt beyond measuring, Lord," he said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of someone choosing his words with extreme care. "Without your kindness, we would have perished in the first storm." "No," Brandr said quickly, the word emerging harsher than he intended. "You owe me nothing." He stopped, struggling to find words for what he felt. "I didn't know. I thought the silver was just for one old man." Halvor's voice carried gentle amusement rather than reproach. "Sit, Brandr. Let me introduce you properly." The old hunter moved around the room with the ease of long practice, placing a gentle hand on each person's shoulder as he spoke their names and stories. There was Gunnar the carpenter, whose workshop had burned in a fire that took his wife and left him with nothing but the clothes on his back. Astrid the weaver, cast out by her clan when a wasting sickness left her too weak to work their looms. Eric and Sigrid, brother and sister, barely past childhood, whose parents had died of fever, leaving them with no relatives willing to take in 2 more mouths to feed. Each introduction felt like a weight settling on Brandr's shoulders. These weren't the lazy or the criminal. They were victims of misfortune, people who had fallen through the careful networks of clan and family obligation that were supposed to protect everyone. In the society that prized strength and self-sufficiency above all else, they had committed the unforgivable sin of becoming vulnerable. The oldest woman, introduced as Ragnhild, had once been a valued healer until her hands began to shake with age, making the precise work of preparing medicines impossible. The youngest, a boy named Bjorn, who couldn't have seen more than 8 winters, bore the twisted leg that marked him as one fate had touched with misfortune from birth. "They came to me one by one," Halvor explained as he ladled stew into a bowl for Brandr. "Word spreads, even in the deep woods, about where a person might find shelter when all other doors have closed." Brandr accepted the bowl numbly, noting how thin the stew was, barely more than broth, with a few pieces of root vegetables floating in it. His saddlebags contained enough fresh meat to make this meager meal into a feast, yet he felt paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was seeing. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Gunnar was the first, 3 winters ago. The others found their way here as need arose." Halvor settled beside him with his own bowl. "I had room, and your silver made it possible to feed more than just myself. 3 winters." For 3 years, Brandr had been unknowingly supporting this refuge, while believing himself generous for taking care of one old man. The mathematical reality was staggering: 7 people surviving on what he had thought adequate for one. Little Bjorn, the boy with the twisted leg, had been watching Brandr with the frank curiosity of childhood. Now he limped closer, his movements careful but determined. "Are you really the Brandr Iron Hand?" he asked, his young voice filled with awe. "The one who split the Sea King's ship with a single blow?" Despite his inner turmoil, Brandr found himself smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. "Stories grow in the telling, lad. It took several blows and I had help, but you did sink it?" "Aye, I did." Bjorn's eyes went wide with delight. "Halvor told us stories about you when you were young like me. How you learned to track deer and shoot a bow." The boy's innocent enthusiasm created a strange counterpoint to the weight settling in Brandr's chest. Here was a child who saw him as a hero from the stories, while he was just beginning to understand how little he truly understood about heroism. "Bjorn," Astrid called gently from her place by the fire. "Let Lord Brandr eat his meal in peace." "He's not bothering me," Brandr said quickly. Something about the boy's eager face reminded him of himself at that age, full of questions and hungry for stories of brave deeds. "What else did Halvor tell you about those days?" As Bjorn launched into an enthusiastic recounting of various tales, Brandr found himself studying the faces around the fire. Despite their obvious poverty and the hardships that had brought them here, there was something in their expressions that struck him deeply. It wasn't just gratitude, though that was certainly present. It was the look of people who had found safety after a long time of fear. This was what his silver had been buying, not comfort for one old man, but security for 7 desperate souls. The realization should have made him proud, yet instead it filled him with a deep unease. He had been paying a debt, fulfilling an obligation, following the proper forms of honor as he understood them. Halvor had been doing something entirely different. "You're troubled," Halvor observed quietly, while Bjorn continued his enthusiastic storytelling. Brandr nodded slowly. "I thought I was being generous. Now I see I was merely adequate." "Adequate has kept us alive through 3 hard winters," Gunnar interjected. "There's no shame in adequacy when it's faithfully given." But there was shame, Brandr realized. Not in what he had done, but in how limited his vision had been. He had seen one old man in need and responded accordingly. Halvor had seen the same resources and multiplied their impact 7-fold. "The meat," Brandr said suddenly, remembering the venison still hanging from Grimjaw's saddle. "I brought fresh deer." The effect on the room was immediate and profound. Faces lit up with a joy that spoke of meals long limited to thin broths and foraged roots. But it was Halvor's expression that struck Brandr most deeply. Not the desperate gratitude he might have expected, but the warm satisfaction of a man seeing his faith in human goodness confirmed once again. "Then tonight we feast," the old hunter announced. And for the first time since entering the cabin, Brandr felt he might have done something truly worthy of the word generosity. The feast that followed was unlike any Brandr had experienced in the great halls of jarls and kings. There was no boasting, no competitive drinking, no elaborate toasts to fallen heroes. Instead, there was something far more precious, the quiet reverence of people who understood. The true value of abundance after knowing genuine scarcity. Brandr watched in fascination as Halvor transformed the fresh venison into a meal that somehow fed 8 people generously while still leaving enough meat to smoke for future meals. The old hunter's knife work was precise and economical, wasting nothing while maximizing every cut. Bones went into a pot for broth, scraps were set aside for morning porridge, and even the hide was carefully cleaned and salted for later use. "You move like a man who has known hunger," Brandr observed as Halvor worked. "All wise men know hunger," the old hunter replied without looking up from his cutting. "It teaches lessons that prosperity never can." The smell of roasting meat filled the cabin, and Brandr noticed how each person's posture changed as the aroma reached them. Shoulders that had been held tight with constant tension began to relax. Eyes that had carried the wary alertness of the perpetually hungry softened with anticipation. Even the children, who had been sitting quietly in the way of youngsters accustomed to scarcity, began to fidget with excitement. As they waited for the meat to cook, stories began to emerge around the fire. Not the grand tales of battlefield glory that Brandr was accustomed to, but smaller, more intimate narratives that revealed the true texture of these people's lives. Ragnhild spoke of the herb garden she had tended for 40 years, her voice soft with memory as she described the careful cultivation of plants that could heal everything from fever to heartbreak. Her hands, which now shook too badly for precise work, moved gracefully as she demonstrated how different herbs should be harvested and prepared. "Knowledge doesn't die just because hands grow unsteady," she said, catching Brandr's eye. "I may not be able to mix the medicines anymore, but I can still teach others what each plant can do." Astrid had begun weaving again, her fingers working with strips of fabric torn from worn-out clothing to create new patterns. The work was slow and careful, each thread placed with deliberate intention. She was making something beautiful from scraps that others would have discarded, a metaphor that wasn't lost on Brandr as he watched her patient. Progress. Gunnar had found wood in the forest around the cabin and was carving it into useful objects, bowls, spoons, handles for tools that had broken. His craftsman's eye saw potential in every piece of fallen timber, and his skilled hands could coax function and beauty from the most unpromising materials. Even the children contributed in their own ways. Eric, barely 12 but already showing the steady temperament that would serve him well in adulthood, had become the keeper of the fire, feeding it carefully, banking the coals at night, ensuring that the warmth that meant survival never faltered. His sister Sigrid, younger and more adventurous, had appointed herself the cabin's lookout, posting herself by the window to watch for wildlife and weather changes, and Bjorn, despite his twisted leg, had found his own role as the group's memory keeper. With the enthusiasm of youth and the attention to detail that physical limitations had taught him, he remembered everything: who needed what when supplies were running low, which stories had been told, and which still waited for the right moment to emerge. Watching them work together with such seamless cooperation, Brandr began to understand something that had eluded him in all his years of warfare and leadership. This wasn't just a collection of desperate people seeking shelter. It had become a family in the truest sense of the word, not bound by blood or clan obligation, but by the deeper ties of shared struggle and mutual dependence. "How do you manage it?" he asked Halvor during a quiet moment when the others were absorbed in their various tasks. 7 people, each with their own needs and griefs. How do you keep them working together instead of falling apart? The old hunter considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't manage them, Brandr. I simply provide the space where they can manage themselves." He gestured toward the busy scene around them. "People who have lost everything understand the value of what little they have left. They don't waste it on petty quarrels or selfish pursuits." Brandr thought of the great hall he had left behind, where grown men would sometimes come to blows over perceived slights to their honor, or disputes over who deserved the choicest cut of meat. Here, in this tiny cabin with its meager resources, such conflicts seemed not just unlikely but impossible. When the meat was finally ready, Halvor served it with the same careful attention he had shown in preparing it. Each person received exactly what they needed, more for the men who did heavy work, appropriate portions for the women and children, special consideration for Ragnhild's smaller appetite and Bjorn's growing boy's hunger. No one complained about their share or envied another's portion. Instead, there was a palpable sense of gratitude that filled the cabin more completely than the smoke from the fire. As they ate, Brandr found himself drawn into conversations that would have been impossible in his usual social circles. Gunnar spoke thoughtfully about the different properties of various woods and how understanding their nature could prevent future fires. Astrid discussed the patterns she saw in nature and how they could be translated into textile designs that would last longer and provide better warmth. These weren't theoretical discussions or abstract philosophy. They were the practical wisdom of people who had learned to see resources where others saw only problems, opportunity where others saw only limitation. "You're different than I expected," Sigrid said suddenly, looking up at Brandr with the directness that only children could manage. "The stories make you sound scary, but you're not scary at all." Brandr felt his face warm with something that might have been embarrassment. "What do the stories say about me?" "That you're huge and fierce, and you never smile and you kill people with your bare hands," Eric chimed in, clearly delighted to be discussing such exciting topics. "I am huge," Brandr admitted with a slight smile. "The rest might be somewhat exaggerated." Bjorn laughed, a sound of pure delight that seemed to make the very walls of the cabin glow brighter. "Halvor said you would be kind. He said all the best warriors are kind to people who can't fight back." The words hit Brandr with unexpected force. Kind to people who can't fight back? Was that what he was being now? Or was this something else entirely? Not kindness extended downward from a position of strength, but respect offered between equals who happened to find themselves in different circumstances. As the evening wore on and the conversation grew softer and more intimate, Brandr realized that his understanding of strength itself was being challenged. In his world, strength meant the ability to impose your will on others, to take what you wanted and defend what you had. Here, he was seeing a different kind of strength, the power to lift others up, to create abundance from scarcity, to build community from the ruins of individual catastrophe. The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows across faces that had grown peaceful with food and warmth and human connection. But for Brandr, the real feast had been the chance to see a different way of living, a different way of measuring a man's worth. Brandr had intended to leave the following morning, to return to his familiar world of great halls and warrior's duties. Instead, he found himself lingering, helping Halvor with the morning tasks and finding excuses to extend his stay. The previous night had opened something inside him that he couldn't quite name, a hunger for understanding that felt as urgent as any battle preparation he had ever undertaken. "You're troubled by something," Halvor observed as they worked together to split firewood outside the cabin. The old hunter's axe moved with practiced efficiency, each blow perfectly placed to follow the natural grain of the wood. Brandr paused in his own chopping, his massive frame dwarfing the tool in his hands. "I've been thinking about what you said, about all wise men knowing hunger. I've never known it, not truly. Even as a boy after my father's death, you made sure I was fed. Physical hunger is only one kind," Halvor replied, setting another log on the chopping block. "There's hunger for purpose, for belonging, for the knowledge that your life serves something greater than yourself. Those hungers can be far more devastating than an empty belly." The words resonated through Brandr's chest like the echo of a struck bell. He thought of the restlessness that had plagued him in recent months, the sense that his victories and reputation had begun to feel hollow despite their reality. How many men had he killed? How many enemies had fallen to his axe? The numbers were impressive by any warrior's measure, yet lately they felt more like weights around his neck than accomplishments to celebrate. "In the great hall," he said slowly, "men speak of legacy as if it were measured in the fear you inspire and the wealth you accumulate. But watching these people last night, seeing what they've built together, you're wondering if there might be other ways to measure a life well lived." Brandr nodded, grateful that the old hunter understood without need for elaborate explanation. Gunnar creates beauty and function from scraps of wood. Ragnhild preserves knowledge that could save lives. Even young Bjorn serves a purpose, keeping track of everyone's needs. What do I create besides corpses and fear? From inside the cabin came the sound of children's laughter, a bright counterpoint to the serious conversation outside. Through the window, Brandr could see Sigrid and Eric helping Astrid with her weaving, their young fingers learning to work the improvised loom she had constructed from fallen branches. "Come with me," Halvor said suddenly, setting down his axe and walking toward the forest edge. "There's something I want to show you." They walked in comfortable silence through the pine trees, following a path so faint that Brandr wouldn't have noticed it without Halvor's guidance. The snow was deeper here, where the canopy blocked most of the wind, and their feet sank with each step. After perhaps a quarter mile, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by a massive fallen tree. The trunk was easily 6 feet in diameter, brought down by some long-ago storm, and now serving as a bridge across a small stream that wound through the heart of the clearing. But what caught Brandr's attention wasn't the fallen giant itself. It was what had grown from its decay. Dozens of smaller trees had sprouted along the trunk's length, drawing nutrients from the rich soil created by its decomposition. Ferns and mosses carpeted its surface, and small animals had built nests in the hollows created by rotting wood. What had once been a single mighty tree had become the foundation for an entire ecosystem. 30 years ago, this was the Forest King, Halvor said, running his hand along the moss-covered bark. Taller than any tree for miles around, strong enough to weather storms that toppled lesser giants. When it finally fell, I thought it was a tragedy. Such magnificence reduced to ruin. Brandr studied the bustling life that now thrived where the great tree had fallen. But its falling wasn't an ending. No, it was a transformation. In death, it gives life to countless others in ways it never could, while standing alone. The old hunter met Brandr's eyes with quiet intensity. Some men spend their lives trying to be the tallest tree in the forest. Others learn to be the fallen log that feeds the growth of future generations. The metaphor hit Brandr with startling clarity. His entire understanding of strength and legacy had been built around the idea of standing tallest, being strongest, inspiring the most fear and commanding the most respect. But here was a different model, power that came from lifting others up rather than towering over them. The people in your cabin, he said slowly. They were falling trees, weren't they? Cast out, forgotten, left to rot, until they found a place where their decay could become someone else's foundation, Halvor agreed. Gunnar's grief over his lost family has made him gentle with other people's sorrows. Ragnhild's failing hands have taught her patience with those who struggle. Astrid's weakness has shown her how to find strength in community rather than self-reliance. They stood in contemplative silence, watching a squirrel dart along the fallen trunk in pursuit of some treasure visible only to its keen eyes. The clearing felt like a cathedral, peaceful and profound in ways that had nothing to do with human construction. I could do more, Brandr said finally. The silver I've been bringing, it's barely adequate for one person, let alone 7. I have resources I've never thought to share. Halvor nodded, but held up a cautionary hand. Generosity can be its own form of violence if it's not given with wisdom. These people don't need a wealthy patron to solve all their problems. They need the chance to build something sustainable, something that will survive even if your support disappears. Then what do they need? Time, space, the security to plan beyond tomorrow's meal. The old hunter gestured back toward the cabin. Gunnar could teach woodworking to young Eric if he had proper tools. Astrid could set up a real loom and create textiles to trade if she had materials. Ragnhild could train someone in herb lore if she had a proper garden to work with. Brandr felt his mind beginning to work in ways it never had before, not planning raids or calculating battle odds, but envisioning possibilities for creation rather than destruction. They need investment, not charity. They need someone who sees their potential rather than just their current limitations. As they walked back toward the cabin, Brandr found himself studying the forest with new eyes. Where before he had seen only trees and snow, he now noticed the subtle signs of life persisting through winter's hardships. Tracks in the snow told stories of creatures adapting to scarcity. Ice-covered streams still flowed beneath their frozen surfaces. Even in the darkest season, life found ways to continue. The cabin came into view just as the afternoon light began to fade. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the single window. Through that glass, Brandr could see the 7 people who had already begun to change his understanding of what strength could mean. But as they approached the door, a new sound reached his ears, the distant baying of hounds carried on the winter wind. Hunting dogs, and from the sound of it, a large pack moving with purpose rather than simply tracking game. Halvor heard it too, his weathered face tightening with sudden concern. "That's not good," he murmured. "Who would be hunting in weather like this?" Brandr asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "No one hunting animals," Halvor replied grimly. "Someone's tracking people." The baying grew closer, echoing through the pine forest, with the relentless purpose of predators closing on their prey. Brandr's warrior instincts kicked in immediately, his mind shifting from philosophical contemplation to tactical assessment with the fluid efficiency of long practice. How many men would travel with a pack that size? He asked, his voice dropping to the low rumble that his enemies had learned to fear. Halvor's expression was grim as he listened to the approaching sounds. 6, maybe 8. Enough to handle whatever they expect to find here. He paused, studying Brandr's face. The question is what they're actually looking for. They moved quickly toward the cabin, where the warm glow of lamplight seemed suddenly fragile against the encroaching darkness. As they pushed through the door, the peaceful scene inside transformed instantly. 7 pairs of eyes turned toward them, and the easy contentment that had filled the room moments before evaporated like morning mist. "Trouble?" Gunnar asked, his craftsman's hands already reaching for the wood-handled knife at his belt. "Hunting party," Brandr replied curtly, moving fast and focused. "They're not after deer." The effect on the room was immediate and heartbreaking. Shoulders that had finally relaxed into security tensed again with familiar fear. Faces that had been open and trusting closed into the careful masks that people wore when survival was uncertain. Even the children seemed to shrink into themselves, their bright curiosity dimmed by the ancient knowledge that danger often wore human faces. Astrid's hands trembled as she set down her weaving. "They've found us," she whispered, and in those 3 words lay a story of running and hiding that Brandr was only beginning to understand. "Found who?" he asked, but Ragnhild was already answering. "Jarl Magnus Blackbeard," the old healer said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "He's been hunting for runaway thralls and debtors throughout the winter. Claims they owe him labor or silver for crimes against his household." The pieces clicked together in Brandr's mind with sickening clarity. These weren't just people who had fallen on hard times. They were fugitives, refugees from a system that would grind them to dust rather than show mercy. Halvor hadn't just been sheltering the unfortunate. He had been harboring the hunted. What crimes? Brandr demanded, though he suspected the answer would make his blood boil. Gunnar's fire spread to Jarl Magnus's grain stores. Eric spoke up, his young voice tight with suppressed anger. It wasn't his fault, the wind shifted, but the Jarl said he had to pay compensation or serve as a thrall for 7 years. Astrid collapsed during harvest, Sigrid added, moving protectively closer to the weaver. She was already sick, but Jarl Magnus said she was malingering. When she couldn't work, he declared her debt doubled for laziness, and us. Bjorn's voice was barely above a whisper. "Our parents died owing the Jarl silver for medicine that didn't work. He said we inherited their debt." Brandr felt rage building in his chest, like a forge fire stoked by steady bellows. This wasn't justice, it was predation disguised as law. Magnus Blackbeard was using the forms of legal authority to create a steady supply of unpaid labor and unchallenged victims. "How long have you been running?" he asked. 3 years for Gunnar, Halvor replied. "The others have been fleeing for various lengths of time. Magnus's hunters sweep through the region every winter. When travel is hard and hiding places are scarce, the sound of dogs grew closer still, accompanied now by the muffled thunder of horses moving through snow." Brandr moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. Through the trees, he could see torchlight flickering, at least 6 riders, maybe more, moving with the confidence of men who believed their quarry was trapped. "They'll surround the cabin," he said, his tactical mind working automatically. "Standard hunter formation, block the exits, call for surrender, then close in if there's resistance." "We could run," Astrid suggested desperately. "If we leave now, through the back, in this snow, with children and an old woman." Gunnar shook his head. "We'd freeze before dawn, even if we could outrun horses and dogs." Brandr studied the faces around him. People who had already sacrificed everything for the chance to live free, now facing the prospect of losing even that small victory. The rage in his chest transformed into something colder and more focused. "There's another option," he said quietly. Halvor's eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Magnus Blackbeard has made a serious mistake." Brandr's hand moved unconsciously to the haft of his axe. "He's brought his hunt to a place where it's not wanted." "Brandr," the old hunter warned, "this isn't your fight. You owe these people nothing beyond what you've already given." But that wasn't true anymore, and they both knew it. Something fundamental had shifted in Brandr's understanding during the past day. These people weren't charity cases or objects of pity. They were family in every way that mattered. And family was worth protecting regardless of the cost. "You're wrong," he said simply. "This is exactly my fight." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew thunderous in the small clearing. Through the window, Brandr could see riders taking positions around the cabin's perimeter. Their torches cast wild shadows between the trees, turning the familiar forest into something alien and threatening. A voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by the crisp winter air. "Halvor Greybeard, by order of Jarl Magnus, you will surrender the fugitives you harbor. They are wanted for debt and theft, and justice demands their return." "Justice," Ragnhild muttered bitterly. "Is that what they're calling slavery now?" Brandr moved away from the window and began checking his weapons with methodical precision. His axe was sharp and perfectly balanced. His sayax was honed to a razor edge. His mail shirt, though not worn, was within easy reach. These were tools he understood, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, he felt truly in his element. "What are you doing?" Bjorn whispered, his young eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Something I should have done years ago," Brandr replied, settling the weight of his axe in his hands. "I'm going to have a conversation with Jarl Magnus about the difference between justice and predation." Halvor caught his arm as he moved toward the door. "They outnumber you. This isn't a battlefield where your reputation will make them hesitate. They're hunting desperate people, not facing down a famous warrior." Brandr smiled, and for the first time in memory, there was no coldness in the expression, only the warm certainty of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Then it's time they learned the difference. Outside, the voice called again, more insistent now. "You have until I count to 10 to open that door. After that we come in, and I won't be responsible for what happens to anyone who gets in our way." Brandr looked around the cabin one final time, taking in the faces of people who had become precious to him in ways he was still learning to understand. Then he lifted the bar from the door and stepped out into the snow-filled clearing to face whatever came next. The moment Brandr stepped into the torchlit clearing, the entire dynamic of the confrontation shifted like ice cracking on a spring river. The hunters had positioned themselves, expecting to face desperate refugees and one aging woodsman. Instead, they found themselves staring at a figure from the songs and stories that shaped their understanding of what true warriors could be. Brandr Ironhand stood 7 feet of muscle and scars, his massive frame made even more imposing by the dancing shadows cast by their torches. His axe hung casually at his side, but every man present recognized the deceptive relaxation of a predator choosing its moment to strike. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved to the center of the clearing, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The lead hunter, a man with the bearing of professional authority, but none of the easy confidence that marked truly dangerous fighters, urged his horse forward a few cautious steps. "You there, identify yourself and stand aside. This is official business of Jarl Magnus Blackbeard. I am Brandr Ironhand," came the simple reply, delivered in a tone that carried no boast or threat, just the quiet certainty of a man stating an undeniable fact. The effect was immediate and profound. Several of the hunters exchanged glances that spoke of suddenly re-evaluated odds. Horses shifted nervously, picking up their riders' tension. Even the dogs seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed in the clearing's atmosphere. The lead hunter recovered his composure with visible effort. "Lord Brandr, we mean no disrespect, but these people are fugitives from lawful authority. They must be returned to face justice for their crimes." "What crimes?" Brandr asked mildly, taking another step forward that somehow managed to seem both casual and threatening. "Debt, theft, destruction of property, a fire that spread in shifting wind, a woman who collapsed from illness, children who inherited their parents' unpayable obligations." Brandr's voice remained calm, but there was something in its depths that made several horses step backward involuntarily. "Tell me, where is the crime in any of that?" The hunter's jaw tightened. "The law is the law, regardless of circumstances. Jarl Magnus has legal claim." "Magnus." Brandr spoke the name as if tasting something unpleasant. "The same Magnus who burned out 3 fishing villages last summer because they couldn't pay his increased tribute. The Magnus who claims ownership of children born to families already in his debt." Now the lead hunter's composure cracked entirely. "You know nothing of—" "I know exactly what Magnus Blackbeard is," Brandr interrupted, his voice dropping to the low rumble that veterans of his battles remembered in their nightmares. "A predator who uses legal forms to justify his appetite for suffering. A coward who sends others to do his hunting because he lacks the courage to face his victims himself." The insult hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Several hunters reached reflexively for their weapons before thinking better of it. The lead man's face flushed with anger and fear in equal measure. "You dare—" "I dare many things." Brandr took another step forward, and this time his movement carried unmistakable threat. "The question is what you dare. Will you ride back to your master and tell him that his hunt ends here? Or will you try to take these people by force?" The clearing fell silent, except for the crackling of torches and the nervous breathing of horses. 7 armed men faced one, but somehow the odds felt reversed. The hunters had expected easy prey. Instead, they had found an apex predator defending territory he had claimed as his own. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, a new voice cut through the winter air with the authority of absolute command. "Stand down, all of you." Every head turned toward the forest edge, where a figure emerged from the shadows between the trees. Tall and powerfully built, with iron-grey hair and a bearing that spoke of battles won and commands obeyed without question. The newcomer rode a war horse that seemed carved from midnight itself. Brandr felt his breath catch in his throat. Jarl Erik, his lord and patron, approached the clearing with the calm deliberation of a man who knew that his presence changed everything simply by existing. The hunters immediately moved their horses aside, creating a clear path to the cabin. Their leader dismounted and bowed deeply, recognizing authority that superseded whatever orders Magnus Blackbeard might have given. "My lord," the hunter stammered, "we were not told you were involved in this matter." Eric's cold eyes swept the assembled men with obvious disdain. Involved? In Magnus's latest scheme to acquire free labor through legal intimidation? Hardly. His gaze found Brandr and held it with questioning intensity. "But when my best warrior disappears for longer than expected, I begin to worry about his welfare." The implication was clear to everyone present. Erik hadn't come to support Magnus's hunt. He had come looking for Brandr. Whatever happened next would be decided not by conflicting legal claims, but by the relationship between Jarl and warrior. "These people," Brandr said carefully, "have done nothing that merits the fate Magnus plans for them. So I gathered from the rather heated discussion I overheard." Erik dismounted and approached the cabin's door with casual confidence. "May I see what has captured my warrior's protective instincts so completely?" The next few minutes felt suspended outside normal time as Erik entered the cabin and met each of the 7 refugees. Brandr watched through the window as his lord spoke quietly with Halvor, examined Gunnar's careful woodwork, and listened with apparent interest to Ragnhild's knowledge of healing herbs. When little Bjorn showed him the carved wolf that Gunnar had made, Erik examined it with the same attention he might give to a weapon's craftsmanship. Most telling of all was his reaction to the children. Erik had lost his own son to fever 3 winters past, and Brandr could see old grief softening his features as Sigrid and Erik gathered courage to speak to the imposing figure. When the Jarl finally emerged from the cabin, his expression was thoughtful rather than decisive. He approached Brandr with the measured steps of a man weighing complex options. "These are not criminals," he said quietly, pitching his voice so the waiting hunters couldn't overhear. "They are victims of a system that Magnus has corrupted for his own gain. Then you'll protect them?" Erik was silent for a long moment, studying his warrior's face with the keen attention that had kept him alive through 30 years of leadership. "You've changed, Brandr. Something in these past 2 days has shifted your understanding of what matters." It wasn't a question, but Brandr answered anyway. "I've learned the difference between standing tall and lifting others up. And you're prepared to defy Magnus Blackbeard to protect these people?" "I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary." Erik nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he turned to face the assembled hunters, his voice carrying the absolute authority that had never been successfully challenged in his domain. "Return to your master," he commanded. "Tell Magnus Blackbeard that these people are under my protection. Any further harassment of them will be considered an act of aggression against my house." The lead hunter's face went pale. "My lord, Jarl Magnus will not be pleased. Jarl Magnus will accept my decision, or he will face the consequences of refusing it." Erik's hand rested casually on his sword hilt, a gesture that spoke volumes about those potential consequences. "Which outcome do you think he would prefer?" The hunters departed with the speed of men who had just avoided a fate worse than failure. Their torches disappeared between the trees, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance until only the peaceful silence of the winter forest remained. But as Brandr watched them go, he realized that Eric's protection, however welcome, was only a temporary solution. Magnus Blackbeard wouldn't simply abandon his schemes because one Jarl had interfered. He would wait, plan, and eventually find another way to claim what he considered his property. The real challenge was just beginning, not the simple confrontation between warriors that Brandr understood so well, but the complex task of building something sustainable in a world that seemed designed to crush the vulnerable beneath its weight. What happens now? Halvor asked, emerging from the cabin with the 7 people who had become the center of this growing conflict. Eric looked at each face in turn, then fixed his gaze on Brandr with an expression that mixed approval with calculation. Now we discover whether my warrior's new understanding of strength can survive the reality of what it means to truly protect someone. It was a challenge, a test, and a promise all wrapped into one. And as Brandr looked at the faces surrounding him, people who had become family, friends who had become responsibility, he felt something settle in his chest that was deeper than duty and stronger than honor. Heike had found his purpose at last. The 3 days that followed Eric's intervention brought a deceptive calm to the forest clearing. Snow continued to fall steadily, blanketing the world in pristine white that muffled sound and softened the harsh edges of winter's reality. Inside the cabin, life settled into a new rhythm as 9 people learned to navigate the complexities of unexpected community. Eric had remained, claiming the need to rest his horse and weather the storm, but Brandr suspected deeper motivations. The Jarl spent long hours in quiet conversation with Halvor, 2 old men sharing perspectives shaped by decades of leadership and responsibility. Their discussions ranged from practical matters, how to sustain a refuge through the remainder of winter, to philosophical questions about the nature of justice in an imperfect world. Magnus won't simply accept defeat, Eric observed during one of their evening talks around the fire. He's invested too much of his reputation in this hunt to abandon it because of one setback. Brandr looked up from where he was teaching Bjorn to carve simple patterns in wood. The boy's twisted leg made many physical activities difficult, but his hands were quick and clever, eager to learn new skills. "What do you think he'll do?" "Appeal to higher authority," Halvor answered, before Eric could respond. "There are Jarls above Jarls, and kings above them all. Magnus will claim that Eric is harboring criminals and demand intervention." Eric nodded grimly. "He's already sent messengers, I'm certain. By spring, there will be pressure from my own overlords to resolve this matter according to traditional law." The weight of that statement settled over the cabin like a physical presence. Traditional law was clear. Debts must be paid, obligations fulfilled, and social order maintained. The fact that the system could be corrupted for personal gain didn't change its fundamental structure or the expectation that it would be respected. "Then we need to change the terms of the conflict," Brandr said, his mind working through possibilities with the same tactical precision he applied to battle planning. "If Magnus is using legal authority as his weapon, we need to find a way to turn that against him." Over the following days, a plan began to take shape through countless discussions and careful consideration of alternatives. It was Ragnhild who provided the crucial insight during a conversation about her years as a healer. "I've seen Magnus's household," she said quietly, her hands working steadily at sorting dried herbs while she spoke. "The women who serve there bear marks that have nothing to do with honest labor. The children show signs of hunger even when the harvest has been good. If he treats his legal property so poorly, imagine what he does to those who have no protection at all." Astrid nodded slowly, her face tight with old memories. "When I collapsed during harvest, other workers whispered about what happened to those who couldn't maintain their pace. People disappeared, and when questions were asked, Magnus would produce documents showing they had been sold to pay their debts." "Sold to whom?" Eric asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Slave traders from the eastern kingdoms," Gunnar replied. Men who don't ask questions about how their merchandise was acquired, as long as the price is fair. The cabin fell silent as the implications sank in. What Magnus was doing went far beyond legal debt collection or even harsh labor practices. He was operating a systematic enterprise that converted free people into valuable commodities. Using the forms of law to disguise what amounted to organized kidnapping. This changes everything, Eric said finally. If we can prove that Magnus is selling his debtors into slavery rather than collecting legitimate obligations, his legal authority becomes meaningless. Brandr felt something cold and focused settle in his chest, not the hot rage of personal offense, but the calculating fury of a warrior who had found an enemy worthy of destruction. We need evidence. I can provide that, a new voice said from the cabin's entrance. Everyone turned to see a figure silhouetted against the snowy clearing, a woman wrapped in travel-stained furs, her face marked by exhaustion and determination in equal measure. She stepped into the lamplight, revealing features that spoke of noble birth despite her obvious hardships. Lady Ingrid. Eric rose to his feet with obvious surprise. What brings you to these remote woods? The woman accepted the bowl of warm broth that Halvor immediately offered, her hands shaking slightly as she cradled it between her palms. The same thing that brought you here, my lord. The need to find truth in a world that seems determined to bury it. As Lady Ingrid told her story, the pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. She was the daughter of a lesser jarl, whose lands bordered Magnus's territory, and she had been conducting her own investigation into her father's mysterious disappearance 3 months earlier. What she had discovered painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond illegal slave trading. Magnus has been systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his activities, she explained, accepting a second bowl of broth with grateful nods toward their hosts. My father began asking questions about missing people from his own lands. Within a week, he was declared dead in a hunting accident that no one witnessed. What evidence do you have? Brandr asked, though he could see from her expression that she carried proof of her claims. Lady Ingrid reached into her travel pack and withdrew a leather satchel that she handled with reverent care. My father's private papers, hidden before his death. Bills of sale for people whose names I recognize. Farmers and craftsmen who were declared debtors and sold to Eastern merchants. And correspondence with other jarls who have been asking similar questions. Eric examined the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood their significance. This is more than enough to bring formal charges before the king's court. But it also makes everyone in this cabin a target for elimination. The truth of that statement hung in the air like an executioner's blade. By sheltering the refugees, they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple dispute over debt collection. They were now witnesses to crimes that could topple one of the region's most powerful men, if they lived long enough to testify. He'll come for us, Astrid said simply. Not with legal hunters this time, but with killers. Bjorn looked up from his carving, his young face serious beyond his years. When? Soon, Lady Ingrid replied. My escape wasn't as clean as I hoped. His men are no more than a day behind me, and they won't be interested in capture. Brandr studied the faces around him, people who had become precious to him, who had changed his understanding of what strength could mean. The thought of losing any of them to Magnus's violence filled him with a cold determination that was different from anything he had felt in battle. Then we don't wait for them to come, he said quietly. We take the fight to them on ground of our choosing. Brandr, Halvor warned, this isn't just about protecting 7 refugees anymore. If Lady Ingrid is right, we're dealing with a criminal enterprise that reaches into the highest levels of regional authority. The forces arrayed against us are still just men with weapons and horses, Brandr interrupted. And men can be defeated if you understand their weaknesses. Eric leaned forward with the keen interest of a commander recognizing strategic thinking. What are you proposing? Brandr moved to the window and gazed out at the forest that had become both sanctuary and potential battlefield. Snow continued to fall, but the storm was weakening. Soon the weather would clear, making travel easier for both hunters and hunted. Magnus's strength comes from operating within the system, using legal authority to justify illegal actions. But that same system becomes a weakness if we can force him to act outside it. He turned back to face the group. We need to make him reveal himself for what he truly is, in a way that can't be covered up or explained away. Over the next several hours, as the fire burned low and the snow gradually stopped falling, they developed a plan that was equal parts brilliant and desperate. It would require precise timing, considerable courage, and the willingness to risk everything on a single confrontation. But if it worked, it would not only save the lives of everyone in the cabin, it would expose a corruption that had poisoned their entire region. As dawn approached and the final details were settled, Brandr found himself thinking about the fallen tree that Halvor had shown him. Sometimes the greatest trees had to fall before new growth could flourish. Sometimes destruction was the necessary prelude to creation. Magnus Blackbeard had built his power on the systematic destruction of the vulnerable. Tomorrow, they would discover whether that foundation was strong enough to survive when the vulnerable decided to fight back. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. They would use Lady Ingrid's evidence to force a public confrontation, drawing Magnus and his supporters into a situation where their true nature would be impossible to conceal. Success would mean justice for countless victims and safety for the refugees. Failure would mean death for everyone Brandr had come to love, as he settled into his furs for what might be his last peaceful sleep. Brandr reflected on how much he had changed since first discovering the 7 souls sharing Halvor's cabin. He had come here believing himself generous for supporting one old man. He was preparing to leave as someone willing to die, protecting a new kind of family, one bound not by blood or law, but by the deeper ties of shared purpose and mutual protection. Tomorrow would determine whether his transformation from warrior to protector would survive its ultimate test. The morning broke clear and bitterly cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made every surface gleam like polished metal. Brandr woke before dawn, his warrior's instincts already alert to the subtle changes in the forest's rhythm that spoke of approaching danger. Through the cabin's single window, he could see tracks in the fresh snow, boot prints and hoof marks that hadn't been there when he'd gone to sleep. "They're here," he said quietly, and the words carried to every ear in the cabin, despite their low volume. Eric was already awake, sitting by the banked fire with his sword across his knees, and the watchful stillness of a man who had survived too many battles to be caught unprepared. How many? Brandr studied the tracks with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading the signs of human movement. 12, maybe 15. They approached from 3 directions and stopped just outside arrow range. Lady Ingrid stirred from her place near the hearth, her noble bearing intact despite a night spent sleeping on a rough floor. Magnus himself? No, Brandr's voice carried certainty. These are hired killers, not household guards. Magnus wants distance between himself and what happens. Here, the 7 refugees had arranged themselves around the cabin with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Gunnar gripped his wood-handled knife with steady hands, while Astrid had positioned herself near the children in a way that suggested she would die protecting them if necessary. Even Bjorn, despite his twisted leg, had found a place where he could be useful, watching through a gap in the wall logs for movement in the forest. Halvor moved among them with calm purpose, checking that everyone understood their role in what was to come. The plan they had developed required precise timing and considerable courage from people who had never been trained for battle. But as Brandr watched their faces, he saw determination rather than fear, the resolve of individuals who had finally found something worth fighting for. "Remember," Eric said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "we need Magnus to reveal himself publicly. Everything depends on drawing him into the open, where his crimes can't be hidden. The sound of approaching footsteps crunched through the snow outside, deliberate and unhurried. These weren't men sneaking up for a surprise attack. They were making their presence known, confident in their numbers and the authority they believed they carried. Halvor Greybeard. The voice that boomed across the clearing was harsh and professional, carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. By order of Jarl Magnus Blackbeard, you will surrender the fugitives you harbor and submit to questioning regarding crimes against lawful authority. Brandr exchanged glances with Eric, both men recognizing the careful phrasing. These weren't killers announcing their intention to murder. They were establishing legal justification for whatever violence would follow. Magnus was still trying to operate within the forms of law, even as he prepared to commit wholesale slaughter. What answer do we give? Halvor asked quietly. Eric stood slowly, his hand resting on his sword hilt with casual readiness. We give them exactly what they expect, resistance that justifies escalation. The next few minutes unfolded with the terrible precision of a ritual performed countless times before. Eric stepped outside to engage in formal negotiations, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing as he demanded to see proper authorization for the arrest of people under his protection. The hired killers responded with increasingly aggressive demands, their patience visibly wearing thin as the legal formalities delayed their intended violence. Through the window, Brandr could see them positioning themselves for assault, men in mail and leather, carrying weapons that spoke of professional expertise rather than simple brutality. They moved with the coordination of a military unit, suggesting that Magnus had invested considerable resources in ensuring this mission's success. They're not going to wait much longer, Lady Ingrid observed, her own noble training allowing her to read the tactical situation with surprising accuracy. They don't need to, Brandr replied, checking his axe one final time. Eric's done his part. Now it's time for mine. The signal came as they had planned, Eric's voice raised in formal challenge, demanding that Magnus himself appear to answer for his accusations. It was the cue for the second phase of their desperate gambit, the moment when everything would be decided by steel and courage rather than words and law. Brandr pushed open the cabin door and stepped into the snow-covered clearing where 15 armed men waited with weapons drawn. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire doorway, and his reputation preceded him like a physical presence that made even professional killers hesitate. I am Brandr Ironhand, he announced, his voice carrying across the forest with the authority that had never failed him in battle. Any man who wishes to harm the people under my protection will have to go through me first. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several of the hired killers exchanged glances that spoke of suddenly recalculated odds and revised expectations of easy victory. But their leader, a scarred veteran with the cold eyes of someone who killed for silver rather than honor, simply smiled with predatory anticipation. 1 man against 15, he called back. Even Brandr Ironhand can't overcome those odds. Brandr's own smile was quieter, but far more dangerous. Then it's fortunate I'm not alone. The forest erupted into motion as warriors emerged from concealment among the snow-laden pines. 20 of Eric's most trusted men materialized from positions they had taken in the pre-dawn darkness, their shields locked and spears leveled with the precision of veterans who had fought together through countless battles. The hired killers found themselves suddenly surrounded, their numerical advantage transformed into a deadly disadvantage. But Brandr's attention was focused on the figure who stepped from behind the largest pine, a man whose presence changed the entire nature of the confrontation. Magnus Blackbeard himself had come, unable to resist witnessing what he believed would be the final elimination of those who threatened his criminal enterprise. The Jarl was smaller than Brandr had expected, but he carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to having others do his violence for him. His beard was indeed black as coal, streaked with silver that spoke of years spent accumulating power through systematic cruelty. When his eyes met Brandr's across the clearing, there was no fear in them, only the cold calculation of a predator evaluating new prey. "Brandr Ironhand," Magnus called, his voice carrying the mocking tone of someone who believed himself untouchable. "I had hoped to avoid this unpleasantness, but you forced my hand by harboring criminals and interfering with lawful authority." "Lawful authority?" Lady Ingrid's voice cut through the winter air as she emerged from the cabin, her noble bearing commanding attention even in the midst of armed confrontation. "Is that what you call selling free people into slavery?" Magnus's confident expression flickered for just a moment, surprise quickly masked, but not quickly enough. Around the clearing, Eric's warriors maintained their positions while the hired killers found themselves trapped between superior numbers and the sudden realization that their employer had walked into a carefully prepared trap. "Lady Ingrid," Magnus said, recovering his composure with visible effort, "how unfortunate that you survived your father's fate. But mistakes can be corrected." The admission hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Magnus had just confessed to murder in front of 40 witnesses, his arrogance finally overcoming his caution. Eric stepped forward with the formal bearing of a man about to pronounce judgment. "Magnus Blackbeard, by your own words you stand condemned of murder, slavery, and corruption of legal authority." You hereby do nothing," Magnus snarled, his mask of civility finally dropping completely. "Kill them all. Leave no witnesses." The battle that followed was brief but savage. The hired killers, trapped and outnumbered, fought with the desperate ferocity of men who knew they faced death regardless of the outcome. Steel rang against steel in the crisp morning air, and the pristine snow quickly became stained with crimson. Brandr found himself facing 3 opponents simultaneously, professional warriors who had studied his reputation and developed tactics specifically designed to counter his legendary strength. They moved with coordinated precision, trying to prevent him from bringing his massive axe to bear while wearing him down with quick strikes from multiple angles. But they had made a crucial error in their planning. They had studied Brandr the legend, the fearsome warrior who fought for glory and gold. They had no understanding of Brandr the protector, the man who had discovered something worth dying for. This new version of himself fought not for personal honor, but for the lives of people who had become family, and that motivation gave him strength beyond anything mere reputation could provide. His axe, Skull Splitter, lived up to its name as he broke their coordination with a devastating overhead blow that shattered one man's shield and the arm that held it. The second attacker found himself impaled on the weapon's backswing, while the third discovered that Brandr's seax was just as deadly in close quarters as his axe was at distance. Around the clearing, Eric's veterans made short work of the remaining killers. These weren't raiders facing desperate farmers, but elite warriors confronting hired murderers, and the outcome was never in doubt once battle was joined. Magnus himself had drawn his sword, but his skills were clearly those of a man who relied on others to do his fighting. When simple Gunnar the carpenter, stepped forward with his wood-handled knife, the corrupt Jarl actually backed away in fear. "Please!" Magnus gasped as the circle of steel closed around him. "I can pay you. Gold, silver, whatever you want. I have resources beyond counting. Resources stolen from people you murdered and enslaved," Lady Ingrid replied coldly. "Resources that will be returned to their rightful owners once you face the king's justice." The fight was over, but the real victory had been achieved the moment Magnus confessed his crimes in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or bought. His own arrogance had destroyed him more completely than any weapon could have managed. As the surviving hired killers were bound and disarmed, Brandr found himself standing in the center of a clearing that had been transformed from sanctuary to battlefield, and back to sanctuary again. The 7 refugees emerged from the cabin, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and wonder at their unexpected survival. Little Bjorn limped through the snow to where Brandr stood cleaning his axe, his young face bright with awe and gratitude. "You saved us," he said simply. Brandr knelt down to meet the boy's eyes, his massive frame folding with surprising gentleness. "We saved each other," he replied, and knew that he was finally speaking the complete truth. 3 months later, the spring sun warmed the clearing where so much had changed during winter's darkest days. The snow had melted away to reveal earth rich with promise, and everywhere Brandr looked, he could see signs of new growth beginning to emerge from what had seemed like barren ground. The cabin had been expanded twice since Magnus's defeat, growing from a simple one-room shelter into a complex of interconnected buildings that housed not just the original 7 refugees, but a growing community of people who had heard whispers of a place where the forgotten could find purpose again. Word traveled slowly but persistently through the networks of the displaced and dispossessed. There was sanctuary in the deep woods for those who had nowhere else to, and Brandr stood in the doorway of what had once been Halvor's solitary retreat, watching the bustling activity that had transformed the clearing into something resembling a small village. Gunnar's workshop hummed with the sound of tools shaping wood into useful objects, while apprentices, young people who had arrived seeking shelter, learned the skills that would eventually make them self-sufficient. The scent of freshly cut timber mingled with the smoke from several hearths and the rich aroma of bread, baking in ovens that hadn't existed when winter held the forest in its grip. Astrid had indeed established her loom, and the textiles she produced with help from other women in the community were beginning to find markets in distant settlements. Her patterns, inspired by the natural beauty of the forest and the resilience of its inhabitants, had gained recognition among traders who valued both quality and the stories behind the goods they carried. "She's finished it," Ragnhild said, approaching with the careful steps of someone whose age was finally beginning to show, but whose spirit remained undiminished. In her hands, she carried a tapestry that told the story of their community's founding, 7 refugees becoming a family, a warrior learning the difference between conquest and protection, and hope taking root in the most unlikely of places. The healer's hands still shook, but her knowledge had found new expression through the young people she had trained in the gathering and preparation of medicinal herbs. The garden she had planted behind the expanded cabin was already showing promise, with early shoots of healing plants breaking through the soil to catch the strengthening sunlight. Eric approached from across the clearing, his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man whose investments had exceeded all reasonable expectations. The Jarl had provided the resources necessary to transform the refuge from a desperate hiding place into a thriving settlement. But the vision and labor had come from the refugees themselves. "The king's response arrived this morning," Eric announced, holding up a scroll sealed with royal approval. "Magnus's lands and holdings are to be distributed among those he wronged, with priority given to former slaves and debtors who can prove their claims." It was justice of a sort, though Brandr knew that no amount of redistributed wealth could truly compensate for the lives that had been destroyed or the years stolen from families torn apart by systematic cruelty. Still, it was a beginning, recognition that power without accountability was tyranny, and that even the most vulnerable deserved protection under law. Lady Ingrid emerged from the largest of the new buildings, where she had been coordinating the complex process of identifying Magnus's victims and documenting their claims for restitution. Her noble bearing had been tempered by months of practical work among people who measured worth by contribution rather than birth. And the change had transformed her from an aristocrat seeking justice into a leader earning respect through service. 237 confirmed cases, she reported. Families broken apart, children sold, craftsmen forced into unpaid labor. It will take years to track down everyone and attempt to reunite them with their relatives. But it will happen, Brandr said with quiet certainty, because now they have advocates who understand what it means to be forgotten. The children's laughter drew his attention to where Eric and Sigrid were teaching. a group of newcomers to read and write, skills that would help them navigate a world that often used ignorance as another form of control. Bjorn, despite his twisted leg, had become one of the most effective teachers. His patience and enthusiasm helping younger children overcome their fear of learning. As evening approached and the community gathered for their shared meal, Brandr found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a warrior defined by the enemies he had slain and the fears he inspired. Tonight, he was surrounded by people whose lives had been immeasurably improved by his protection, but who had, in turn, taught him what protection truly meant. "You're different," Halvor observed, settling beside him with the bowl of stew that had become their evening ritual. "Not just changed, transformed." Brandr nodded, watching the faces around the fire that now represented his true family. "I used to think strength meant standing tallest, being feared, commanding respect through force. And now I know that real strength means creating space for others to grow, providing shelter for those who need it, and building something that will last beyond your own lifetime." The old hunter smiled, his weathered face creasing with satisfaction. "Your father would be proud of the man you've become." As the fire burned lower and conversations grew softer around the clearing, Brandr reflected on the lessons he had learned in this place. The silver coins that had once represented his understanding of generosity now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by something far more valuable: the knowledge that true wealth lay in the connections between people and the communities they could build together. Some debts, he had learned, could never be repaid, only honored through a lifetime of service to something greater than oneself. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the greatest gifts were those that demanded not repayment, but transformation, turning recipients into givers and victims into protectors. The spring air carried the promise of growth and renewal, and in the distance, Brandr could hear the sound of new arrivals making their way through the forest toward the light that now shone every night from their growing community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people in need of shelter, new opportunities to prove that strength and compassion could coexist. But tonight, surrounded by family he had chosen and who had chosen him in return, Brandr Ironhand, protector, builder, and guardian of the forgotten, was exactly where he belonged.